Picture this, the year is 1888, and the streets of London are cloaked in a thick, choking fog. Gas lamps flicker weakly against the darkness, casting eerie shadows on the cobblestones. Somewhere in the labyrinth of alleys, a woman's hurried footsteps echo, then vanish. The newspapers the next morning will whisper of another unsolved disappearance, another mystery swallowed by the fog. But this isn't just another night in Victorian England. It's a glimpse into an era brimming with secrets, where the line between progress and the profoundly strange blurred in ways that still baffle us today. The Victorian era, stretching from 1837 to 1901, wasn't just about prim manners, corsets, and steam engines. Beneath the polished surface of top hats and tea parties lay a world teeming with the bizarre events so peculiar they'd make even the most skeptical among us pause. From seances that captivated royalty to entire towns gripped by mass hysteria over ghostly apparitions, this was a time when science and superstition waged a silent war in the shadows. And while you might know about Jack the Ripper or the Crystal Palace, what about the time a respected surgeon claimed to have discovered the elixir of life? Or the night hundreds of Londoners swore they saw a phantom airship hovering silently overhead, decades before airplanes existed? This is a journey into the forgotten corners of history, where the ordinary twisted into the extraordinary. Over the next 30 revelations, we'll peel back the layers of a world that defies easy explanation. A world where reality seemed to fray at the edges. Some of these stories will chill you, others might make you laugh in disbelief, but all of them will leave you wondering, how much do we really know about the past? And what if the Victorians weren't just eccentric but onto something we've since forgotten? Stoke the fireplace, keep a lantern close, and let's step into the unknown together. Imagine a summer so foul that the very air turned thick with the stench of human waste, a smell so overpowering it drove lawmakers from their chambers. This was London in 1858, when the Thames River, the lifeblood of the city, transformed into a festering open sewer. For decades, the river had been treated as a dumping ground, absorbing the waste of millions alongside the blood and offal from slaughterhouses, the chemical runoff from tanneries, and the rotting debris of unchecked industry. But that June, as temperatures soared, the Thames reached a tipping point. The water slowed to a sickly trickle, its surface choking under a visible layer of filth. Newspapers described it as a monster soup, a broth of disease so potent it turned handkerchiefs pressed to faces brown within minutes. The crisis had been brewing for years. London's population had exploded, yet its sewage system remained medieval, a tangled mess of crumbling cesspits and overloaded drains that emptied directly into the river. When the heatwave hit, the methane bubbling up from the sludge became thick enough to ignite. Barges caught fire mid-river. Fish floated belly up in such numbers that their rot added to the miasma. But the final straw came when the stench reached the halls of Parliament, whose windows overlooked the Thames. Legislators, drenched in sweat and gagging, tried draping curtains soaked in chloride of lime to mask the smell. When that failed, they fled mid-debate, handkerchiefs clamped over their noses. The politicians dubbed it the Great Stink, but for the city's poor, crammed into riverside slums, it was a death sentence. Cholera outbreaks had already claimed thousands. Doctors at the time still blamed bad air, not the contaminated water they drank and washed with. Yet from this horror came one of history's most radical public health revolutions. Engineer Joseph Bazalgette was tasked with redesigning London's sewers, a project so colossal it required 18,000 miles of brick-lined tunnels, enough to stretch halfway around the world. His system not only diverted waste away from the Thames but introduced gravity-fed gradients so precise they still function flawlessly today. The reforms didn't just mask the problem, they redefined modern sanitation. Within years, cholera rates plummeted, riverside property values soared, and for the first time in centuries, Londoners could open their windows in summer without fearing the air itself might kill them. The Great Stink was a wake-up call, proof that even in an age of empire and innovation, progress sometimes had to start with something as simple as admitting the world had grown too filthy to ignore. The streets of St. Giles, one of London's poorest slums, were already drowning in misery long before the flood hit. But on October 17, 1814, the disaster that swept through the neighborhood wasn't water, it was beer. At the Mew and Company brewery, towering wooden vats held enough porter to quench the thirst of half the city, each one as tall as a 3-story house. That afternoon, without warning, one of the massive storage tanks split open with a groan, unleashing a 15-foot wave of fermenting ale. The force shattered neighboring vats like matchsticks, sending over 300,000 gallons of frothy, dark beer roaring into the streets. Witnesses described the scene as something from a nightmare. The tsunami of alcohol crashed through brick walls, uprooted paving stones, and swept bystanders off their feet. In the basement of the nearby Tavistock Arms, a mother and daughter were sharing a quiet drink when the wall behind them exploded inward. They drowned in seconds, crushed beneath barrels and debris. Nearby, a wake turned to tragedy as the beer surge collapsed the building, burying mourners under rubble. In total, 8 people died, not from intoxication, as dark humor might suggest, but from blunt force trauma and drowning in what newspapers grimly called the liquid avalanche. The aftermath was as surreal as the disaster itself. Rescuers waded through waist-deep beer, their boots sticking to streets now coated in a foamy, reeking sludge. Dozens of survivors, many drenched and injured, were pulled from the wreckage only for opportunistic locals to descend with buckets and pots, scooping up free beer from the gutters. The brewery's owners, initially blamed for negligence, were cleared when investigators found the vat's iron hoops had rusted from the inside out, invisible until it was too late. The courts ruled it an act of God, though the bereaved family saw little divine mercy in a catastrophe born of cheap materials and lax oversight. Yet the flood left an unexpected legacy. Public outrage over the shoddy construction of the vats spurred reforms in industrial safety standards, forcing breweries to adopt sturdier materials and regular inspections. The tragedy also exposed the desperate conditions of St. Giles, where crumbling buildings and overcrowded cellars had magnified the death toll. And though the brewery rebuilt, Londoners never forgot the day their city drowned in beer, a bizarre footnote in history where progress once again flowed from the wreckage of the unthinkable. The workshop was frozen in time, sawdust still clinging to the air, tools laid out as if their owner had merely stepped away for tea. Yet cabinet maker James Wentworth would never return to finish the elegant mahogany desk half-carved on his bench. It was 1843 when neighbors first noticed the silence from his London shop. No rhythmic rasp of the plane, no clatter of chisels. When concern grew thick enough to warrant investigation, the scene they found would fuel whispers for decades. Wentworth had been a craftsman of rare skill, known for his intricate inlay work and secretive methods. Clients swore his cabinets seemed to fit together without nails or glue, as if the wood itself obeyed his hands. But on that final day, nothing pointed to struggle or haste. His coat still hung by the door, his lunch sat untouched on a stool. Only the ledger lay open to a page dated 2 days prior, the ink smeared as if abandoned mid-entry. Theories spiraled from the plausible to the fantastical. Some insisted Wentworth had stumbled upon a guild secret too dangerous to know, whisked away by rivals who saw his talent as a threat. Others whispered of a doomed love affair, citing the single rose found pressed inside his account book. But the most chilling account came from a delivery boy who swore he'd seen Wentworth through the shop window that very morning, working intently beside a shadowy figure in outdated 18th century attire, the two conversing in low tones before both vanished into the back room. Authorities found no evidence of foul play, no signs of departure. His savings remained untouched, his home undisturbed. Even the half-completed commissions showed no indication of interruption. just a craftsman mid-stroke, leaving behind a mystery as finely constructed as his cabinets. The case might have faded into obscurity if not for the odd detail that surfaced years later. Several of Wentworth's finished pieces scattered across London's elite households began developing an uncanny trait: drawers that opened without being touched, locking mechanisms that released at midnight, and one wardrobe that reportedly emitted the faint scent of sawdust every year on the anniversary of his disappearance. Whether curse, coincidence, or the lingering touch of a master who never truly left, the vanishing cabinet maker remains one of the era's most haunting riddles, a reminder that even in an age of industry and logic, some shadows refuse to be explained away. The master of the house never saw the blow coming. On a quiet November night in 1849, wealthy merchant Samuel Redwood and his wife Celia retired to their bedroom in Bermondsey's most elegant townhouse, unaware their trusted servants had already plotted every grim detail. By dawn, the couple would be dead, their skulls shattered with a coal hammer, their throats slit so deeply the blade nearly decapitated them. But what made the crime truly unforgettable wasn't just its brutality. It was the way this bloody act ripped open Victorian England's carefully maintained facade of domestic harmony, exposing the simmering class resentments beneath. The killers, housemaid Eliza Gibbs and butler Frederick King, had played their roles perfectly for years. Gibbs, with her demure curtsy and spotless apron, was praised for her quiet diligence. King, ever the proper servant, kept the silver polished and the wine cellar stocked. Yet behind closed doors, they'd grown obsessed with the Redwood's fortune, particularly the strongbox Celia kept under her bed, stuffed with banknotes from her husband's textile empire. Their plan was chillingly methodical. After serving the couple their evening tea laced with laudanum, they waited until the drug's grip was absolute. Then King fetched the hammer from the scullery. News of the murders spread like wildfire, thanks to the penny press's gleeful obsession with every macabre detail. The Illustrated Police News printed lurid sketches of the crime scene. The four-poster bed drenched in blood, the walls spattered with gore, while reporters breathlessly recounted how the killers had washed the corpses and dressed them in nightclothes before fleeing, hoping to disguise the massacre as a natural death. They might have succeeded if not for the laundress who noticed Gibbs scrubbing red-stained linens at dawn, or the pawnbroker who recognized King trying to sell Celia's sapphire earrings. The trial became a national spectacle, crammed with gasping spectators eager for a glimpse of the monsters in human form. Prosecutors painted the crime as the ultimate betrayal, emphasizing how the servants had exploited intimacy for violence. They knew which creaking floorboard to avoid, the barrister thundered, which door hinges needed oiling to muffle their steps. The defense, meanwhile, spun a tale of desperation. King's gambling debts, Gibbs's bastard child starving in a workhouse, but Victorian juries had little sympathy for those who bit the hand that fed them. Their hanging at Newgate drew such a crowd that vendors sold meat pies and ginger beer to those jostling for a view. Yet the case left deeper scars than the gallows could heal. For years afterward, mistrust festered between wealthy households and their staff. Employers installed peepholes to spy on servants, while maids whispered of Redwood's ghost haunting the homes of cruel masters. The Bermondsey Horror became shorthand for the era's darkest fear, that behind every polite "yes, sir" and "no, ma'am," the help might be sharpening their knives. The first attack came without warning on a fog-drenched night in 1837. Mary Stevens, a servant girl walking home through Clapham Common, barely had time to scream before the figure lunged at her from the darkness. Witnesses would later describe a towering silhouette with clawed hands and eyes that burned like coals, but what chilled Mary to her core wasn't just his appearance. It was how he moved. With a single bound, he cleared a 6-foot wall as if gravity meant nothing, his cape billowing behind him like something from a penny dreadful. By the time London's constables arrived, the creature had vanished, leaving behind only scorch marks on the grass and a terrified girl babbling about fire breathed into her face. Thus began the reign of Spring-Heeled Jack, a phantom who defied all logic. Over the next decade, sightings exploded across the capital. A butcher's boy in Limehouse swore the demon leapt clean over his cart, landing with a metallic clang before tearing at his clothes with fingers cold as a corpse's. Two sisters in Bow claimed he'd shattered their bedroom window, his face glowing phosphorescent beneath a tight-fitting helmet, his mouth spewing blue flames that singed their curtains. The press, sensing sales gold, printed every wild account, from his alleged ability to scale vertical walls to the bizarre detail that his claws appeared to be made of brass. Authorities vacillated between dismissal and panic. The Lord Mayor of London initially dismissed the stories as hysterical fancy, until his own niece described being ambushed near Blackfriars Bridge by a figure who vaulted over the parapet and vanished into the Thames without a splash. Soon, vigilante mobs roamed the streets armed with garlic and crucifixes, while enterprising printers sold anti-Jack charms guaranteed to repel the fiend. Even Queen Victoria's household wasn't immune. A sentry at Buckingham Palace fired his musket at a cloaked figure perched atop the gates, only for the thing to somersault backward into the night with a mocking laugh. Theories about Jack's identity spiraled into the absurd. Some insisted he was a deranged aristocrat experimenting with Chinese fireworks and mechanical springs. Others whispered of a fallen angel or a ghostly highwayman returned from the 18th century. The most compelling explanation emerged decades later, when historians uncovered military records describing an experimental, jumping infantry project, soldiers strapped into spring-loaded boots meant to clear battlefield obstacles. Had some half-mad officer taken the prototype for a nocturnal spin, we'll never know for certain. What lingers isn't just the mystery, but what Jack revealed about Victorian society. Here was an era obsessed with progress yet still steeped in folklore, where gas lamps illuminated streets but couldn't banish the fear of things that lurked just beyond the light. Spring-Heeled Jack wasn't merely a phantom, he was the perfect embodiment of a culture caught between reason and the irresistible pull of the uncanny. The headline stopped pedestrians in their tracks on August 25, 1835. Great astronomical discoveries, blared the New York Sun, claiming a famed British astronomer had glimpsed life on the moon through an advanced new telescope. What followed wasn't just a story, it was an intricately crafted fantasy that would captivate the world. According to the Sun's serialized articles, Sir John Herschel's observatory in South Africa had revealed lunar forests, sapphire mountains, and even winged humanoids resembling bats, all living under a sky devoid of stars. Readers devoured descriptions of moon bison with hairy flaps protecting their eyes and temple-dwelling creatures who communicated in melodic hums. The paper sold out within hours. At the heart of the hoax lay a perfect storm of Victorian obsessions. The era's public was ravenous for scientific wonders. Balloon flights and steam engines had made the impossible feel within reach. Yet most lacked the literacy to separate fact from fabrication. The Sun's anonymous writer, later revealed to be journalist Richard Adams Locke, exploited this gap masterfully. He laced his prose with enough technical jargon to sound credible, referencing real astronomers and actual telescope specifications. Even the pacing felt deliberate. Each installment teased new discoveries, letting excitement build like a serialized novel. By the time prominent scientists began questioning the claims, the story had already crossed the Atlantic, reprinted in European papers as fact. Edgar Allan Poe, himself a hoaxer, reportedly fumed that someone had beaten him to the idea. The fallout was as revealing as the scam itself. When the Sun finally admitted the series was fiction, public reaction split between amusement and outrage. Some readers admired the sheer creativity, while others, particularly devout Christians, felt betrayed by implications that lunar beings challenged biblical uniqueness of Earth. Yet the hoax's legacy endured. It forced newspapers to grapple with ethics in reporting, spurred genuine astronomical interest among the masses, and even influenced science fiction. Decades later, astronomers noted how the descriptions of Herschel's fictional telescope eerily foreshadowed actual advancements in lens technology, perhaps the most fascinating twist. The hoax inadvertently advanced science education. Suddenly, lecturers couldn't fill halls fast enough to explain what the moon really was. Telescopes sold out as amateur stargazers sought their own glimpses beyond the sky. In an age where spectacle often trumped truth, the Great Moon hoax proved that even deception could, in its roundabout way, illuminate the hunger for discovery, a hunger the Victorians understood better than anyone. The dinner began like any other evening at the Priory, the sprawling villa Charles Bravo shared with his new bride Florence. Silver gleamed under gaslight, servants moved silently between courses, and conversation flowed easily until it didn't. By midnight, the 30-year-old barrister was writhing in agony, his body racked with convulsions so violent they knocked over bedroom furniture. Doctors summoned to his bedside recognized the symptoms immediately: antimony poisoning, a substance as cruel as arsenic but slower acting, dragging out suffering for days. As Bravo's screams echoed through the house, one question hung thick in the air: who would want the charming, ambitious lawyer dead? The answer, it turned out, was practically everyone under his roof. Florence, his wife of just 4 months, was the first suspect. A widow when they married, her first husband had died under similarly mysterious circumstances, a fact Charles reportedly taunted her about during arguments. Then there was the house's other resident, Florence's longtime companion, Jane Cox, who'd initially suggested the death was suicide before doctors ruled it murder. Servants whispered about the couple's vicious fights, how Charles had cut off Florence's access to her inheritance and openly despised Jane. Even the stable boy fell under scrutiny after police found a bottle of tartar emetic, a common antimony compound, in the stables. Yet the most damning clue came from Charles himself. Between bouts of vomiting, he allegedly murmured, "Florence, you've poisoned me." The ensuing inquest became a Victorian scandal sheet's dream. Reporters breathlessly chronicled every salacious detail: Florence's rumored affairs, Charles's cruel control over her finances, even Jane Cox's unorthodox sleeping arrangements near the couple's bedroom. Forensic science of the era offered few certainties. Toxicology couldn't pinpoint when the antimony had been administered, and the lack of stomach burns suggested it had been slipped into his wine gradually over days. Without conclusive evidence, the jury returned an open verdict blaming persons unknown. But history hasn't been so kind to the suspects. Modern scholars note glaring inconsistencies in Florence's account. Her claim that Charles self-administered the poison to treat indigestion defied medical logic. Jane Cox's abrupt departure for Jamaica shortly after the inquest raised eyebrows, while the stable boy's sudden wealth post-trial hinted at possible hush money. Even the household's dynamics suggest darker possibilities. Some theorize Florence and Jane conspired to eliminate a tyrannical husband, while others believe Charles's professional enemies exploited the household's dysfunction to frame his wife. What makes the Bravo case endure isn't just its unsolved nature, but how it laid bare Victorian domesticity's darkest undercurrents. Behind drawn curtains and manicured gardens, marriages could be battlegrounds, servants silent witnesses, and poison the perfect weapon for those trapped by society's expectations. Charles's tombstone bears no accusation, only the cryptic epitaph, "Whosoever believeth in me shall never die." A fitting epitaph for a mystery where truth, like the killer, remains forever just out of reach. The lamps went out all at once, not with the gradual dimming of a clouded moon or the flicker of a dying wick, but in a single, breathless moment on the evening of August 13, 1862. Across London, from the slums of Whitecapel to the glittering chandeliers of Mayfair ballrooms, darkness fell like a curtain. Gaslights guttered out as if snuffed by invisible fingers. Street vendors' torches dissolved into smoke. Even the steady glow of factory furnaces winked into nothingness, leaving workers stumbling in sudden blindness. The city, heart of an empire that spanned continents, had been swallowed whole. Panic moved faster than reason. Householders fumbled for tinderboxes, only to find their matches refused to spark. Telegraph operators tapped frantically at silent machines. Along the Thames, ship captains blared foghorns to avoid collisions in the ink-black void. The most terrified were the astronomers. Observatories reported that the stars themselves had vanished, the night sky rendered featureless as wet charcoal. Clergymen rushed to pulpits, declaring it a sign of God's wrath, perhaps for the war raging in America, or Britain's own factories churning out weapons for both sides. By midnight, whispers spread of witchcraft, of a new plague descending, even of an enemy attack using some infernal scientific weapon. Yet what made the blackout of 1862 so chilling wasn't just the darkness, but what thrived within it. Dozens reported hearing distant, unearthly music like glass harmonicas playing just beyond perception. Others swore they felt gusts of wind in sealed rooms or the brush of unseen hands against their faces. In Clerkenwell, a midwife delivering twins by candlelight screamed when the flame abruptly reignited, only to burn upside down, its wax-defying gravity as it pooled upward. The phenomena weren't confined to human witnesses either. Zookeepers found lions cowering in corners, ravens falling silent in their cages, and every hound in the city howling in unison for precisely 13 minutes before abruptly stopping. Morning brought neither answers nor apologies. As dawn's grey light crept over the city, lamps flared back to life unaided, stars reappeared, and the world pretended nothing had happened. Official statements blamed atmospheric disturbances, citing sunspot activity reported by observatories in Calcutta, but the damage was done. Sales of Bibles spiked. Spiritualist churches gained thousands of new members overnight, and for decades after, Londoners born that year carried an odd superstition. They refused to sleep without at least one candle burning, as if expecting the darkness to return someday and next time stay for good. The blackout became a cultural spectre, proof that even in the age of steam and steel, nature could still humble mankind with mysteries no science could yet explain. The crowds outside the Royal Courts of Justice had never seen anything like it. Swelled to thousands by May 1872, they roared their approval or scorn depending on which side of the Tichborne claimant debate they favored, because the man at the center of this legal circus was either the greatest impostor of the Victorian age or the victim of the most outrageous conspiracy. It began when Sir Roger Tichborne, heir to one of England's oldest aristocratic fortunes, reportedly drowned off the coast of South America in 1854. His grieving mother, Lady Henrietta, refused to accept his death. For years, she placed advertisements across the British Empire offering a reward for information about her lost son. Then, in 1866, a butcher from Wagga Wagga, Australia, stepped forward claiming to be the missing heir. Arthur Orton was everything Sir Roger wasn't: barrel-chested where the aristocrat had been slender, coarse-mannered where Tichborne was educated at Eton. He spoke with a Cockney accent rather than the family's refined French-inflected English. Yet when this rough around the edges colonial arrived in England, Lady Henrietta embraced him instantly, declaring him her long-lost son despite the glaring discrepancies. She furnished him with wealth, reinstated his inheritance, and launched a legal battle to reclaim his title. The public went wild. Newspapers splashed daily updates about the claimant's improbable backstory. He claimed amnesia, a shipwreck, years spent cattle herding in the outback. His supporters, largely working-class Britons who relished the idea of an aristocrat living among commoners, funded his defense through public subscriptions. The establishment, however, smelled fraud. What followed was the longest and most expensive trial in British legal history up to that point. For 188 days, prosecutors meticulously dissected every inconsistency in Orton's tale. Tichborne's former schoolmates testified he spoke fluent French. The claimant couldn't order breakfast in the language. Ship manifests proved Roger had never boarded the vessel Orton described. Even the claimant's tattoos became evidence. His anchors and mermaids didn't match Sir Roger's documented markings, yet the defense countered with strange details that gave pause. The claimant knew intimate family secrets only the real Roger would recall, like the location of a childhood hideaway in the Tichborne Estates woods. Public opinion split along class lines. The aristocracy and legal elite saw an obvious fraud, while the working classes cheered for the underdog challenging an unjust system. The trial became a referendum on wealth, identity, and who deserved to be believed. When the jury finally rejected his claim, Orton's supporters rioted in the streets shouting, "We'll have our rights." He was later convicted of perjury and sentenced to 14 years, but the fascination never faded. From prison, he published memoirs. After release, he toured music halls reenacting his trial for paying audiences. The Tichborne saga exposed more than just one man's deception. It revealed how desperately Victorians wanted to believe in second acts, how grief could warp even a mother's perception, and how easily identity could become a performance when enough people were willing to applaud. In an era before fingerprints or DNA, the case forced society to ask, how do we really know who someone is, and what happens when the story becomes more compelling than the truth? Blood pooled between the floorboards before anyone noticed something was wrong. On December 7, 1811, Timothy Marr's linen shop on Ratcliffe Highway should have been bustling with Saturday evening trade. Instead, neighbors grew uneasy at the unnatural silence seeping from the shuttered windows. When a customer finally forced his way inside, the scene froze him in place. Marr lay sprawled behind the counter, his skull crushed almost beyond recognition. Upstairs, his wife Celia slumped against the cradle of their 3-month-old son, both beaten to death with such force that splinters of the weapon lodged in the ceiling. Only the apprentice, hidden beneath a pile of blood-soaked fabric in the cellar, survived to whisper about the well-dressed stranger who'd come asking for cheap muslin minutes before the screams began. The panic hadn't even crested when the killer struck again. 12 nights later, just streets away, publican John Williamson and his entire household were slaughtered in the same brutal fashion. This time, witnesses saw the aftermath in full horror. A maid's fingers nearly severed as she tried to shield her face, the landlord's wife with her throat cut so deeply her head lolled backward. The murder weapon, a shipwright's maul stolen from a nearby dockside pub, was left standing upright in a pool of gore as if planted like a macabre trophy. London hadn't seen violence this brazen since the days of highwaymen. What made the Ratcliffe Highway Murders particularly chilling was their calculated cruelty. Unlike crimes born of passion or poverty, these killings bore the mark of someone who took pleasure in the act itself. The city's fledgling police force, barely more than night watchmen with lanterns, floundered under public fury. Homeowners barricaded doors with furniture. Dockside workers formed armed patrols. Even the Prince Regent reportedly slept with pistols under his pillow. Then, as abruptly as the terror began, it seemingly ended. A weaver named John Williams, lodging at the same boarding house as the mall's original owner, was arrested after neighbors reported his bizarre behavior. He'd burned his shoes in the hearth, they claimed, and muttered about voices in the walls. Before investigators could build a solid case, Williams hanged himself in his cell with a handkerchief. Authorities declared the matter closed, parading his corpse through the streets in an open cart before burying it at a crossroads with a stake through the heart, as tradition demanded for suicides. Yet doubts lingered like the stench of the unwashed slums. Williams left no confession, no clear motive. Some speculated he'd been framed by the real killer, others that he belonged to a smuggling ring silencing informants. The murders exposed how ill-equipped London was to handle such crimes, driving the creation of more organized policing decades before the Metropolitan Police's founding. Ratcliffe Highway became shorthand for urban nightmares, proof that even in an era of gaslight and enlightenment, darkness could still slip through the cracks. Glomy's castle's stone walls held more than just the echoes of Scottish nobility. They concealed a horror the family would deny for generations. The whispers began in earnest around 1840, when workmen repairing the ancient stronghold reportedly broke through a hidden chamber no blueprint had ever documented. What they saw inside sent them fleeing into the night, abandoning their tools. The Earl of Strathmore, owner of the castle, paid them handsomely for silence, but money couldn't stop the story from spreading like heather fire. Servants spoke of a figure glimpsed at barred upper windows, his face grotesquely misshapen, his hands pressed against the glass as if begging for release. The legend took a stranger turn when Queen Victoria herself requested to stay at Glomy's in 1842. Accounts vary on whether she was shown the secret. Some claim her hosts deliberately kept her from certain corridors, while others insist she left abruptly after hearing inhuman moans from behind paneled walls. What's certain is that by the 1860s, the monster of Glomy's had become Scotland's worst-kept secret. Even the family's own relatives weren't immune to the rumors. One heir, Claude Bowes-Lyon, reportedly encountered his monstrous kin during a late-night exploration of the castle's labyrinthine passages. He emerged pale and trembling, refusing ever to speak of what he'd seen, though his journals later referenced the poor soul in the tower who wept when the pipers played. Descriptions of the creature varied wildly over decades of gossip. Some insisted he was a throwback to some primitive ancestor, covered in coarse hair with ape-like features. Others claimed his deformities were more specific, a torso too large for his stunted legs, fingers fused together like flippers, or a head that seemed to merge directly with his shoulders. The most chilling accounts came from stable boys who swore they'd seen him at moonlit windows, his mouth working soundlessly as he traced the same symbols over and over on the fogged glass. The truth, if it exists, may be buried in the Strathmore family's notorious secrecy. When pressed by journalists in 1895, the then Earl reportedly snapped, "We are not a family to be questioned about such things." Modern scholars speculate the monster might have been Thomas Bowes-Lyon, a legitimately born but severely disabled heir whose existence threatened the family's social standing. Others suggest a case of genetic disorder like porphyria, the same disease rumored to afflict George III, or even the result of generations of aristocratic inbreeding. Whatever lurked behind Glomy's walls left an indelible mark on history. The story inspired everything from Gothic novels to horror films, its power undimmed by time. Perhaps because it touches something primal in us all, the fear that behind every grand facade, behind every polished family tree, there might be something we'd rather keep locked away. The monster of Glomy's wasn't just a secret, it was a mirror reflecting the Victorian era's deepest anxieties about bloodline, normality, and the price of maintaining appearances at any cost. The gold shipment should have been impregnable, locked inside an iron safe bolted to the floor of a first-class carriage, guarded by 2 armed clerks, and traveling at 30 miles per hour through the Kentish countryside. Every precaution had been taken. Yet on the night of May 15, 1855, the South Eastern Railway's London to Folkestone Express became the stage for one of the most brazen heists in history. By the time the train screeched into Ashford Station, £12,000 worth of gold bars, nearly £1 million in today's money, had vanished without a single shot fired. The thieves' plan was as daring as it was meticulous. Earlier that evening, a well-dressed passenger named William Pierce, later revealed to be a former railway clerk, had boarded at London Bridge. He struck up a conversation with the guard, offering swigs from a brandy flask laced with laudanum. By the time the train reached Reigate Junction, the guard was slumped unconscious in his compartment. Pierce then signaled accomplices waiting along the tracks, who swung aboard as the train slowed on a gradient. Using coppered keys, they unlocked the safe, tossed the heavy gold bars to men riding alongside on horseback, and even replaced the stolen cargo with bags of lead shot to avoid arousing suspicion until the next scheduled inspection. What followed wasn't just a manhunt, but a watershed moment in criminal investigation. Scotland Yard's fledgling detective division, barely 2 years old, faced public ridicule for their initial blunders. They wasted days interrogating dockworkers in Dover, convinced the gold had been smuggled to France. The breakthrough came from an unlikely source. A ostler at a Rochester pub recognized Pierce's description from wanted posters, recalling how the man had drunkenly boasted about outsmarting the Iron Road. When authorities raided Pierce's Lambeth lodgings, they found not just meticulous notes on train schedules and safe mechanisms, but something far more damning, a receipt for a custom-made waistcoat with reinforced stitching, designed to secretly carry gold bars without tearing. Pierce's trial captivated the nation, not least because he conducted his own defense with theatrical flair. He mocked prosecutors for focusing on a gentleman's tailoring choices, produced fake alibi witnesses, and even attempted to bribe jurors with gold sovereigns hidden in their lunch baskets. Though ultimately convicted and sentenced to 14 years transportation, he achieved a perverse immortality inspired by his exploits. Parliament passed the Railway Protection Act, mandating time-locked safes and armed escorts for high-value shipments. Yet the greatest legacy of the Great Train Robbery wasn't legal reform, but how it captured the Victorian imagination. Here was crime elevated to spectacle, where ingenuity trumped brute force. Pierce became a folk antihero, his story serialized in penny dreadfuls and later immortalized by Michael Crichton's novel. In an era obsessed with progress, the heist held up an unsettling mirror. For every invention designed to protect society, there would always be someone waiting to outwit it. The gold was never recovered. Some say it's still hidden in a Kentish field, waiting for some lucky farmer's plough to strike lead and uncover the glittering truth beneath. The telegraph clicked relentlessly in the signal box at Battersea that October morning 1864 had been a wet autumn, and the rails gleamed dangerously slick under a steady drizzle. Signalman James Eastman was nearing the end of his 12-hour shift at Hyde Park Junction when the Brighton Express roared past his post, right on schedule at 8:45. But as he reached to log the train's passing, the telegraph erupted again. The downline local from Vauxhall was running late, already 11 minutes behind. Eastman hesitated. The rulebook was clear: trains must never follow each other closer than 5 minutes. Yet the station master had been pressuring crews all month to make up delays, muttering about shareholders and punctuality. With shaking hands, Eastman gave the all clear. What happened next unfolded with nightmarish precision. The Brighton Express, carrying over 300 passengers, slowed unexpectedly near Clapham Junction when a faulty axle box began smoking. Meanwhile, the lumbering local train, packed with labourers and shopgirls, barreled forward under full steam, its driver unaware the express had nearly stopped ahead. At 9:18, the local ploughed into the rear of the express at nearly 30 miles per hour. The sound of splintering wood and screeching metal carried for miles. First-class carriages accordioned into each other, flinging passengers like rag dolls. One witness described a woman's bonnet floating eerily above the wreckage, still tied beneath her severed head. Chaos reigned in the aftermath. Surgeons from nearby St. George's Hospital arrived to find survivors pinned under twisted iron, their screams mingling with the hiss of escaping steam. The death toll climbed to 13, with over 70 injured, many hideously maimed by flying glass and jagged timber. But what truly shocked Victorian society wasn't just the carnage. It was the revelation that Eastman had been working consecutive shifts for a week straight, surviving on gin and bread to stay awake. The Board of Trade's investigation exposed a system rotten with corner cutting. Signalmen paid a pittance, timetables manipulated to please investors, safety protocols ignored to keep trains running like clockwork. Public outrage forced changes that would define modern rail travel. The disaster spurred mandatory interlocking signaling systems, mechanical fail-safes preventing human error from creating conflicting signals. Shift limits were imposed, and the railway companies begrudgingly accepted that profit couldn't always outpace prudence. Yet the Hyde Park disaster's darkest legacy was its glimpse of industrialization's human cost. For every gleaming locomotive symbolizing progress, there were hundreds of working-class lives treated as expendable, a truth laid bare that rainy morning when metal met flesh, and Victorian efficiency collided with its own recklessness. The wreckage was cleared within days, but the scars on London's conscience would take far longer to heal. Louis Le Prince should have been a household name. By 1890, the French inventor had patented an early motion picture camera, shot the world's first surviving film footage of Leeds Bridge, and was days away from a triumphant public demonstration in New York that might have rewritten cinema history. Instead, on September 16th, he boarded a train in Dijon bound for Paris and stepped into oblivion. No witnesses saw him alight, no ticket stub was found. His luggage, including the precious camera prototypes, remained in his locked compartment when the train reached its destination. The man who'd captured movement on film had himself become a phantom, leaving behind only whispers of foul play and a rivalry that would shadow the birth of moving pictures. Theories erupted like magnesium flares in the decades after his disappearance. Some pointed to Thomas Edison, whose own kinetoscope patent battles heated up just as Le Prince vanished. Edison's agents were known to strong-arm competitors. He'd later sue over 50 filmmakers for patent infringement, and Le Prince's widow became convinced her husband had been murdered to eliminate a rival. Others suggested financial motives. Le Prince owed money to his brother, whose sudden suicide weeks after the disappearance raised eyebrows. Even family members weren't immune to suspicion. His own son admitted decades later that he'd been questioned about possibly poisoning Louis over an inheritance dispute. The most haunting twist came in 1991, when a Paris police archive yielded an 1890 photograph of a drowning victim pulled from the Seine. The bloated face bore an uncanny resemblance to Le Prince, yet the timing didn't fit. The corpse was found weeks before his last confirmed sighting. Unless the photograph's date was wrong or the disappearance itself staged, the image became one more riddle in a case already overflowing with them. Le Prince's legacy is a study in cruel irony. His 16-lens camera design, though cumbersome, captured fluid motion where Edison's single-lens experiment still stuttered. Had he lived, cinema's evolution might have accelerated by years. Instead, his patents expired, his name faded, and Edison seized the narrative literally. When the War of Currents gave way to the Battle of the Kinetoscope, Edison's team allegedly destroyed competing devices, including one of Le Prince's cameras. Today, only 2 seconds of his Leeds Bridge footage survive, a ghostly glimpse of what might have been, much like the man himself. History favors the victors, but mysteries favor the vanished. Whether Le Prince fell victim to industrial espionage, personal vendetta, or simply chose to walk away from his own life, his disappearance remains the original cliffhanger of cinema, a reel that cuts to black before the final act, leaving audiences forever guessing what really happened in those dark frames between the station platform and the empty train carriage. The painting wasn't anything special, just a cheap reproduction sold by the thousands in British department stores during the 1950s. A rosy-cheeked boy with tears glistening on his cheeks, his face tilted upward as if pleading for comfort. But by the summer of 1985, this ordinary artwork had become the center of a national panic, blamed for a string of house fires so bizarre, even veteran firefighters were spooked. The legend went like this: wherever the crying boy painting hung, disaster followed. Flames would reduce entire rooms to ashes, yet the painting itself would always be found unscathed, staring up from the wreckage with those same mournful eyes. The hysteria reached its peak when the Sun newspaper published an article titled "Blasphemous Portraits Burn Homes." Dozens of readers wrote in with chilling accounts. A Sheffield family swore their living room erupted in flames moments after the boy's glass frame cracked for no reason. In Essex, a woman claimed the painting's eyes glowed red seconds before her curtains ignited. Fire departments reported receiving frantic calls from homeowners demanding they remove the cursed artwork. One crew in Yorkshire allegedly found 12 copies abandoned on their station steps. Even skeptics grew uneasy when an Essex firefighter catalogued over 50 cases where the painting survived blazes untouched, calling it the damnedest thing I've seen in 20 years on the job. Digging deeper revealed layers to the myth. The original artist, Italian painter Bruno Amadeo, was said to have used a real orphan as his model, a boy who perished in a fire after Amadeo refused to adopt him. Others whispered the painting carried a gypsy's curse, or that the varnish contained flammable chemicals that somehow protected the canvas. The truth was far more mundane. Mass-produced prints like these often used fire-retardant materials to meet safety standards, explaining why they survived when cheaper frames and furniture burned. As for the fires, pure coincidence amplified by selective memory, no one reported the thousands of homes where the painting hung harmlessly for decades. Yet the psychological grip of the curse proved harder to extinguish. The Sun capitalized on the frenzy by organizing public burnings of the paintings, only for readers to claim the fires spread unnaturally fast. Psychologists later noted how the legend exploited primal fears. A child's face symbolizing innocence corrupted, the tears hinting at some unspoken tragedy waiting to repeat itself. Even today, decades later, you'll find the occasional crying boy painting lurking at flea markets or in attic boxes, and the superstitious still flinch when they recognize those haunted eyes. Whether curse or coincidence, the story endures as proof that even in a rational age, we'll always make room for one more ghost story. The wedding had been the grandest anyone could remember. The great hall decked in holly and ivy, the fire roaring, the guests laughing as the young bride, radiant in lace and silk, led them all in a game of hide and seek. No one thought twice when Lord Lovell's daughter, just 16 and flushed with joy, darted toward the ancient oak chest in the corner. It was large enough to climb inside, the perfect hiding spot. But as the hours passed and the merriment continued, no one noticed she hadn't emerged. The guests assumed she'd slipped away with her new husband. The groom, thinking she'd grown tired and retired, never thought to check. It wasn't until days later, when a faint, sickly sweetness hung in the air, that a servant lifted the chest's heavy lid and found her. The iron-bound oak had sealed shut with a cruel, sudden snap, its antique latch falling into place behind her. Her frantic scratching on the lid, her screams muffled by the thick wood, had been drowned out by the music and laughter just feet away. By the time they found her, the horror of those final hours was etched into her contorted limbs, her wedding gown torn to ribbons by desperate fingers. The story, first whispered in the 1820s, spread like wildfire through Victorian England, morphing with each retelling. Some said the chest had been cursed by a jealous suitor. Others swore the ghost of a previous Lovell bride, betrayed centuries earlier, had guided the latch shut with spectral fingers. What made the legend stick wasn't just the tragedy, but how it preyed on Victorian anxieties. Here was a bride symbol of purity and domestic bliss snatched away on the very threshold of a new life, not by some Gothic villain, but by a mundane object in her own home. The tale resonated in an era obsessed with domestic safety, where gas leaks, faulty locks, and poorly ventilated rooms turned houses into inadvertent death traps. Soon, variations sprouted across the country. A chest in a Norfolk manor that emitted sobs every Christmas Eve, a Scottish castle where a ghostly wedding dress rustled near an antique trunk. Even the Great Hall at Bramshill House, where the original story was set, became a pilgrimage site for thrill seekers, though historians later debunked the connection. The story's true power lay in its unanswered questions. Why had no one heard her? How could such a lively gathering mask a death happening in its very midst? The Victorians, for all their progress, lived with constant reminders of how thin the line was between celebration and catastrophe. The mistletoe bough became a cautionary tale whispered to children, a ghost story told at Christmas parties, both entertainment and subconscious warning about the dangers lurking in familiar places. And though the original chest was said to have been burned, countless country houses still claim to own the real one, its lid creaking open on winter nights, releasing the faint scent of rose perfume and decay. Perhaps the most unsettling detail of all, the song. In 1834, composer Bailey turned the story into a ballad, its jaunty melody belying the grim lyrics. Music halls across Britain sang it, audiences clapping along to a tune about a girl who hid where no one thought to look. The dissonance was pure Victorian genius, a way to laugh at the darkness, even as it lingered in the corners of every festively decorated room. The beach at Vintame Hill should have been peaceful that August morning in 1889, just waves lapping at golden sand, seabirds wheeling overhead. But when fishermen stumbled upon the two bodies, any illusion of tranquility shattered. The men lay side by side in formal black suits, their faces hidden beneath crude lead masks molded to their features. Nearby, a cryptic note fluttered in the breeze, its contents so unsettling the Brazilian authorities initially refused to disclose them. Over a century later, the lead masks case remains one of history's strangest unsolved mysteries, with threads stretching back to the shadowy corners of Victorian occultism. Autopsies revealed no signs of violence, no trace of poison. The men later identified as Portuguese immigrant laborers Miguel José Viana and Manuel Pereira da Cruz had died of apparent heart failure, their muscles rigid as if seized by sudden terror. But it was the objects found with them that fueled speculation. A small notebook filled with indecipherable symbols, empty glass vials smelling faintly of almonds, and most chillingly, instructions in one man's pocket detailing precise astronomical alignments for that very date. The lead masks themselves were no theatrical props, each weighed nearly 5 pounds, their eye holes carefully filed to allow limited vision. Whoever wore them expected to need protection from something. Rumors swirled that the pair belonged to a secret society dabbling in etheric experimentation, a Victorian-era obsession with harnessing invisible energies said to permeate the universe. Occult journals of the period described lead as a shield against astral projections or celestial radiation, notions popularized by figures like Madame Blavatsky and her Theosophical Society. More disturbingly, police uncovered links between the men and a Rio de Janeiro apothecary known for supplying rare chemicals to European spiritualists. Was this some botched attempt to commune with otherworldly forces? Skeptics proposed alternate theories. Perhaps the masks were part of an ill-fated scientific endeavor, like early radiation research gone awry. Others suggested the men were fleeing persecution, their disguises meant to thwart the burgeoning technology of photography used by bounty hunters. But the notebook's symbols matched no known code, and the astronomical references pointed to Sirius, a star long associated with occult knowledge. Even the location held significance. Vintame Hill overlooked a bay where, decades earlier, slaves had practiced syncretic religions blending African traditions with Catholicism. Was this a case of cultural appropriation turned deadly, the truth dissolved like mist under scrutiny? Witnesses came forward claiming to have seen the men days earlier, purchasing the lead from a local metalsmith while muttering about preparing for ascent. Another reported hearing chanting in the hills that night, glimpsing robed figures holding aloft strange lanterns. By the time investigators pursued these leads, the trail had gone cold. The apothecary's shop mysteriously burned, the fishermen who found the bodies plagued by nightmares until they too died abruptly. What lingers isn't just the puzzle of two men who dressed for their own deaths, but how their story mirrors Victorian England's own dance with the uncanny. In an age when science and superstition collided daily, when seances drew prime ministers and arsenic wallpaper killed children, the lead mask's case feels like a grotesque ritual of its time, one where humanity's hunger to pierce the unknown sometimes led it straight into the abyss. The masks remain preserved in a Rio evidence room, their hollow eyes still guarding secrets we'll likely never uncover. The music never started, but the dancing wouldn't stop. In the sweltering summer of 1832, a village near the Rhine became the stage for one of history's most unsettling medical mysteries. It began with a single woman, a baker's wife, who stepped into the town square one evening and began twirling uncontrollably. Within days, dozens more had joined her, their limbs jerking as if pulled by invisible strings. They danced until their shoes split open, until their feet bled onto the cobblestones, some collapsing from exhaustion only to resume their grotesque waltz the moment they regained consciousness. Local physicians bled them, priests sprinkled holy water, yet the frenzy spread like wildfire. This was no festive celebration. It was the last great outbreak of Europe's infamous dancing plague, a phenomenon that had haunted the continent for centuries. What made the 1832 episode so chilling was its timing. Europe was buckling under cholera outbreaks and failed harvests, its people steeped in the kind of collective despair that makes bodies rebel against minds. Some historians point to ergot poisoning, a fungus infesting rye crops that produces LSD-like hallucinations and muscle spasms. The symptoms align eerily. Victims described feeling an irresistible inner fire, their movements accompanied by visions of saints or devils. Yet other outbreaks defied easy explanation. In 1516, a woman in Strasbourg danced for 6 days straight, her episode igniting a chain reaction that eventually drew 400 people into the streets, dozens perishing from heart attacks or strokes mid-pirouette. Theories abound about what truly drove these epidemics. Medieval chroniclers blamed curses or demonic possession. Enlightenment scholars' finger wagged about female hysteria. Modern neurologists suggest mass psychogenic illness, a kind of societal panic attack manifesting as physical compulsion. But the 1832 event added a sinister twist. Many dancers claimed to hear phantom orchestras, their music perfectly synchronized despite no musician being present. A visiting doctor documented one man who swore he saw skeletal violinists perched on rooftops, their bows drawing screams instead of notes. What lingers isn't just the horror, but what these outbreaks reveal about the human psyche under siege. In an era before trauma was understood, before stress could be quantified, bodies became the stage where societal terrors performed. The dancing plague was more than illness. It was a grotesque protest of the flesh against a world that demanded too much and offered too little. No cure was ever found. The dancers simply stopped one by one, leaving behind footprints stained red, and questions were still scrambling to answer. The first time Mary Jane Heaster saw her daughter's ghost, she was scrubbing laundry near the hearth, her hands raw from lye soap. The figure materialized not in some shadowy corner, but right beside the washtub. Zona Heaster's twisted neck turned at an impossible angle, her wedding dress hanging in tatters. Over 4 successive nights in 1897, the apparition returned, each visit more vivid than the last, until it finally spoke the words that would rip open a murder case. "Edward killed me. He broke my neck." What followed wasn't just a mother's grief hallucination, but one of the only trials in American history where spectral testimony helped send a man to prison. Zona's death had initially been ruled trivial, a female weakness, leading to a fall, according to the local doctor. Her husband, Edward Shue, the town's charismatic blacksmith, played the grieving widower with theatrical flair, insisting on dressing Zona's corpse himself in a high-necked gown with a stiff collar. Mourners at the wake noticed his odd behavior, hovering possessively near the coffin, preventing anyone from adjusting his wife's neck, but small-town decorum kept suspicions muted. That is, until Mary Jane swore out an affidavit detailing Zona's ghostly accusations, forcing the prosecutor to order an exhumation. The autopsy revealed vertebrae crushed with such force that even the skeptical county coroner admitted no fall could have caused it. What made the Greenbrier ghost case extraordinary wasn't just the supernatural element, but how it exposed the era's dark gender dynamics. Zona had been a vivacious young woman marrying beneath her station. Edward had two previous wives who died under murky circumstances, whispers of brutality clinging to him like cold dust. Yet without Mary Jane's relentless campaign and those chilling midnight visitations, the truth might never have surfaced. The trial became a referendum on whose word mattered, a mother's vision or a husband's privilege. Prosecutors strategically avoided mentioning the ghost in court, but its specter loomed over every testimony, swaying a jury inclined to dismiss women's intuition as hysteria. Edward's conviction shocked West Virginia's legal establishment, but the aftermath proved even stranger. Mary Jane never wavered in her account. Even as skeptics accused her of exploiting spiritualist trends, the late Victorians were obsessed with seances and spirit photography after all. Yet modern forensic re-examinations confirm Zona's injuries were unmistakably homicidal, suggesting Mary Jane's visions, however uncanny, led investigators to tangible evidence they'd otherwise have ignored. Today, Zona's headstone in Greenbrier County reads simply, aged 24 years, but locals still leave violets at her grave, small purple offerings for the woman whose voice from beyond the grave refused to be silenced. The case endures as a macabre footnote where justice and the supernatural collided, proving that sometimes the dead tell tales the living dare not. The shovel struck something solid just 3 feet down, not with the dull thud of damp New England soil, but with the hollow resonance of wood on wood. When the men of Exeter, Rhode Island, pried open Mercy Brown's coffin that frigid March morning in 1892, what they found sent a ripple of horror through the gathered crowd. 19-year-old Mercy had been dead nearly 2 months, yet her body showed barely any decay. Her heart and liver were filled with what the local paper described as fresh, clotted blood, her lips parted as if caught mid-whisper. To the terrified townsfolk, there was only one explanation. Mercy had become the consumptive vampire, draining the life from her surviving brother Edwin. What followed wasn't just superstition. It was a desperate collision of grief, germ theory, and Gothic terror that revealed how thin the line was between medicine and myth in the Victorian mind. The panic had been building for years. Tuberculosis, known then as consumption, ravaged entire families, its victims wasting away as if some unseen force siphoned their vitality. When Edwin Brown fell ill after burying his mother and sister, the pattern felt supernatural. Folk traditions imported from Europe whispered of the undead corpses that fed on the living to sustain their own rotting flesh. The remedy was gruesome but logical to terrified rural communities. Exhume the suspected vampire, burn its heart and lungs, and force the ashes down the throat of the afflicted. Mercy's father, a reluctant participant in the ritual, watched as the town doctor complied with the mob's demands. Edwin drank the grim concoction and died weeks later anyway. What makes the Exeter incident so revealing is its timing. This wasn't medieval Europe but the cusp of the 20th century, when germ theory was revolutionizing medicine. Yet in isolated pockets of New England, old-world folklore fused with scientific frustration. If doctors couldn't stop the White Plague, perhaps the answers lay in older, darker wisdom. Newspapers as far as New York covered the exhumation, oscillating between mockery and morbid fascination. Editorialists sneered at the backward ruralites, even as urban spiritualist societies debated whether vampirism might explain otherwise mysterious illnesses. The tragedy of Mercy Brown, a young woman whose only crime was dying too young, became a cautionary tale about fear's power to warp reason. Modern analysis suggests the freezing New England ground preserved her body naturally, while the blood in her organs was likely decomposition fluid. Yet the story's grip on the imagination endured. Bram Stoker's Dracula, published just 5 years later, wove similar themes of disease and superstition, with accounts victims exhibiting consumptive symptoms. Even today, Mercy's grave in Exeter's Baptist churchyard draws visitors, some leaving trinkets as tributes, others checking nervously for signs of disturbed earth. Her case stands as a stark reminder that progress doesn't always march in a straight line, and that sometimes, in the shadows between what we know and what we fear, even the most rational societies can find themselves reaching for a stake and a shovel. The farmer's plow struck stone where there should have been soft earth, a metallic clang ringing out across William Newell's Cardiff, New York, field in October 1869. What his workers unearthed that autumn morning defied belief. A 10-foot-tall figure of a man, limbs twisted as if frozen in agony, his skin textured like weathered rock. Word spread faster than the railroad could carry it. By sundown, neighbors were arriving with lanterns, gasping at the colossal, petrified giant lying stiff in his earthen tomb. Within weeks, thousands would pay 50 cents apiece, over $10 today, just to glimpse this so-called ancient wonder, never suspecting they were witnessing one of the 19th century's most audacious hoaxes, a prank that would expose the era's hunger for marvels and the public's startling willingness to believe. The Cardiff Giant's creators knew exactly which Victorian nerves to strike. Newell's cousin George Hull, a cigar manufacturer and staunch atheist, had secretly commissioned the statue from Chicago stonecutters after an argument about biblical giants mentioned in Genesis. Hull injected the scheme with just enough plausibility. The gypsum figure was artificially aged with sulfuric acid to mimic erosion, its pores pocked with needles to resemble pores. Even the burial site was strategic. Cardiff lay near Onondaga County's famed salt springs, allowing Hull to whisper that mineral-rich waters had preserved the body. When clergymen declared the giant proof of Scripture's literal truth, and paleontologists, initially fooled by the weathering techniques, authenticated it as a prehistoric relic, the charade reached dizzying heights. What made the scam so mesmerizing wasn't just its scale, but how it mirrored the era's contradictions. This was the golden age of Barnum's circus freaks and dime museum oddities, where audiences clamored to see Fiji mermaids and two-headed calves. Scientific discovery raced alongside superstition. Darwin's Origin of Species had shaken the world just a decade prior, leaving many desperate for tangible links between myth and reality. The giant became a Rorschach test. Creationists saw divine validation, while progressive thinkers heralded it as evidence of human evolution. Even after geologists exposed the statue as a fraud by noting tool marks and the absence of fossilization, crowds kept coming, proving Barnum's adage that people enjoyed being fooled if the lie was entertaining enough. The fallout peeled back layers of societal pretension. Yale paleontologist Othniel Marsh, who'd initially endorsed the giant, became its loudest debunker, cementing his reputation while mocking rivals who'd been duped. Hull and Newell, after pocketing over $20,000 in admission fees, eventually confessed, but not before selling exhibition rights to a syndicate including Barnum himself, who created a replica when denied the original. Courts later ruled no fraud had occurred, since the exhibitors genuinely believed their own hype. Today, the Cardiff Giant lounges in a Cooperstown museum, his cement grin forever frozen mid-chuckle. His real legacy isn't the hoax itself, but what it revealed about an era where wonder and gullibility walked hand in hand, where the line between education and entertainment blurred as easily as acid-etched gypsum. In a world hungry for the extraordinary, sometimes the most remarkable thing isn't the spectacle, but how eagerly we agree to see it. The first sighting came on a crisp November evening in 1896, when Sacramento residents craned their necks at a shaft of light slicing through the twilight. Witnesses described a cigar-shaped craft over 100 feet long, gliding silently above the rooftops with a brilliant searchlight sweeping the ground. Then came the whispers someone aboard had tossed down a length of rope. even spoke to onlookers in an unfamiliar accent before the vessel vanished into the clouds. Over the next 6 months, hundreds of similar reports flooded in from across America and Britain. Long before Zeppelins patrolled the skies, farmers in Nebraska swore they'd seen a grounded airship with mysterious occupants repairing its hull. A Texas sheriff claimed to have chased the craft on horseback, watching it ascend vertically at impossible speed. London newspapers carried accounts of a metallic dirigible hovering over the Thames, its silhouette backlit by strange blue flares. What made these sightings so unsettling was their eerie consistency. Witnesses from California to Cornwall described the same sleek, torpedo-like shape, the same unnerving quiet where propellers should have roared. Some accounts mentioned paddles or wings moving in unison like a mechanical bird, while others told of shadowy figures peering over the railings, figures sometimes dressed in what appeared to be futuristic, close-fitting garments. The airships seemed to favor rural areas, often appearing near railroad tracks or telegraph lines as if studying them. In one particularly chilling incident in Arkansas, a farmer reported encountering 2 pale, gaunt men beside their grounded craft who demanded barrels of water, not for drinking, they clarified, but for energy storage. When he obliged, they allegedly handed him a small, smooth metal disc inscribed with untranslatable symbols before departing. Skeptics blamed mass hysteria fueled by Jules Verne's popular fiction or the era's breakneck technological advances. Aeronauts like Samuel Langley were making headlines with steam-powered flying machines, while Thomas Edison himself stoked speculation by declaring heavier-than-air flight imminent. But the sheer volume of independent accounts, many from credible witnesses like police officers and military personnel, defied easy dismissal. Even more perplexing were technical details that outpaced known science, descriptions of retractable landing gear, directional spotlights, and maneuvers no balloon of the era could achieve. The Chicago Tribune quipped that the airships displayed more engineering sense than our entire patent office, while British authorities quietly investigated whether Germany had leapfrogged ahead in secret aviation experiments. The phenomenon's abrupt end in spring 1897 only deepened the mystery. No wreckage was ever found, no inventor came forward, and the few blurry photographs published in newspapers showed only indistinct smudges against twilight skies. Modern UFO enthusiasts point to the airship wave as early extraterrestrial visitation, while historians note parallels to later phantom rocket scares during the Cold War. Perhaps the most plausible explanation lies in the Victorian psyche itself, a society straining between the known and the unknowable, where gaslight and telegraph wires made the impossible feel tantalizingly close. The airships weren't just machines, they were manifestations of an era's collective imagination, vapor trails left by humanity's hunger to reach beyond the limits of its age. And like all the best mysteries, they vanished before anyone could prove otherwise, leaving behind only questions suspended in the thin air of the past. The storm hit without warning, great walls of black water lunging at the SS London as she plowed through the Bay of Biscay on that January night in 1866. The steamship, a proud vessel of iron and steam carrying 260 souls, had been built to conquer oceans. Yet within hours she was dying, her hull groaning like a wounded animal as waves stove in her hatches. Passengers in the saloon heard the first roar of seawater flooding the engine room, the sudden tilt of the floorboards as the ship listed violently. But what made the London's wreck unforgettable wasn't just the tragedy, it was the chilling composure of Captain John Martin, whose final acts would blur the line between bravery and something far more unsettling. Survivors 19 out of 260 described scenes ripped from a Gothic nightmare. The ship's chaplain, Reverend William Drake, later wrote of watching the captain strap himself to the ship's wheel, his face eerily calm as he shouted coordinates to the lifeboat crews. "Lash yourselves to the boats or the sea will take you," he bellowed over the wind, his voice carrying an uncanny certainty. Moments later, as the last lifeboat pulled away, Martin was seen lighting his pipe with steady hands, the glow of the ember reflecting in his eyes as the deck slipped beneath him. One sailor swore he heard the captain murmur, "The sea has wanted us, and now it will have us," before the waves closed over the bridge. The wreck's aftermath rippled through Victorian society for reasons beyond the sheer loss of life. The London had been a symbol of modern triumph, one of the first steamships to regularly brave the Australia run, yet her demise mirrored older, darker maritime superstitions. Sailors noted she'd carried an unusual cargo, a crate of church bells destined for Melbourne Cathedral, which many believed angered the sea. More pragmatically, investigators blamed the ship's innovative but fatally flawed design. Her low freeboard and overloaded coal bunkers made her sit dangerously deep in the water. When the storm hit, she had no chance to rise with the swells, transforming into little more than a sinking iron coffin. Perhaps the most haunting legacy came from the survivors' accounts of the lost. Hours before the sinking, passengers reported hearing ghostly choir music drifting from the hold, likely the shifting bells misheard through the storm's howl, but forever remembered as a morbid prelude. And then there was the purser's ledger, washed ashore months later in Cornwall, its pages bleached blank except for a single entry, "All settled." Whether a mundane notation or something more ominous, those words seemed to echo Captain Martin's eerie resignation. The London's wreck became a cautionary tale about the arrogance of the machine age, a reminder that for all humanity's ingenuity, the sea remained an unconquered frontier where death could arrive as swiftly as a wave and with just as little mercy. Archer Avenue in Chicago was never meant to be haunted. Paved over old Native American trails in the late 19th century, it was a straightforward road until the night in 1934 when a young woman in a tattered white dress stepped into the beam of a motorist's headlights. Her name, according to those who have glimpsed her since, is Resurrection Mary, a phantom whose story is steeped in the grief-soaked rituals of Victorian mourning. Drivers describe picking her up near the gates of Resurrection Cemetery, her skin icy even through gloves, her breath smelling of winter. She'll murmur an address on Archer, then vanish before the car reaches it, leaving only the scent of roses and a lingering chill where she sat. What makes Mary more than just another roadside ghost is how tightly her legend intertwines with the era's funeral customs. The dress witnesses describe a flowing gown with lace detailing, matches photographs of Victorian burial attire, where the dead were often posed in their finest clothing to simulate peaceful sleep. The cemetery where she's most often seen, Resurrection, was founded by Polish immigrants whose 19th-century tombstones bear the same floral carvings Mary's phantom fingers trace when she's spotted near the iron gates. Even her name echoes the Victorian obsession with elaborate epitaphs. Resurrection wasn't just theological optimism, but a common motif on headstones from the 1880s, promising literal rebirth in an age when child mortality made such comforts necessary. The most chilling accounts come from those who have interacted with her directly. In 1939, a dancehall violinist swore a pale girl in an antiquated dress begged him to play the anniversary waltz at the now-defunct O. Henry Ballroom, only to collapse weeping when he obliged, her gloved hands leaving frost on his sleeve as she fled into the night. Decades later, cemetery workers found the bars of a mausoleum bent outward with inhuman force, grooves in the metal matching the width of a woman's fingers. Forensic analysis ruled out tools. The damage looked as if something had pulled itself free from inside. Skeptics dismiss Mary as urban legend, but historians note an eerie parallel to real tragedy. Records from 1896 mention a Mary Bregovi, 16, killed by a streetcar while walking home from a dance in an identical location. Her funeral notice specifies a white dress, as befits an innocent, a phrase lifted straight from Victorian burial guides. Whether ghost or collective memory, Resurrection Mary endures as a sorrowful bridge between eras, a reminder that grief, like some spirits, refuses to stay buried. The next time you drive Archer Avenue past midnight, check your rearview mirror. If the seats suddenly damp with melted frost, you might have given death a ride home. Snow wasn't supposed to bear witness, yet on the morning of February 9, 1855, the residents of Devon woke to a trail that defied explanation. Overnight, something had marched across 60 miles of countryside, leaving a single line of hoof prints, each one perfectly shaped like a cloven foot, pressed deep into the frozen crust as if the creature carried immense weight. The prints appeared on rooftops, scaling vertical walls without disturbance, crossing rivers without breaking stride, even marking the snow inside walled gardens without disturbing a single gate. By midday, terror had taken root. Farmers barred their doors, vicars clutched crucifixes, newspapers splashed headlines about the devil's footprints, and suddenly, every shadow in rural England seemed to harbor something older than reason. What made the phenomenon so unsettling was its eerie precision. The prints measured exactly 4 inches long, spaced 8 inches apart in an unwavering straight line. No meandering, no pauses, just mechanical regularity. Witnesses described them as glowing faintly, the edges melted slightly as if seared by unnatural heat. Some swore the trail led right up to church doors before veering away, as if repelled by hallowed ground. Others found them zigzagging across the Exe estuary, where the prints vanished abruptly mid-river, only to resume on the opposite bank. Even skeptics faltered when faced with the sheer scale. From Topsham to Littleham, the path cut through villages, crossed fields, and even scaled a haystack without displacing a single straw. Theories erupted like steam from a pressure valve. Superstitious locals insisted Satan himself had walked Devon that night, citing the hoof shape and the trail's apparent immunity to mortal obstacles. Naturalists scrambled for explanations: badgers, otters, even experimental hot air balloons dragging chains. The most plausible culprit, a panicked kangaroo escaped from a private menagerie, couldn't account for the prints' supernatural consistency or their impossible paths over roofs. Even Charles Darwin, then revising his theory of natural selection, reportedly mused about undiscovered species, while clergymen warned of divine punishment for an industrializing England. But the true horror lay in what happened next. Nothing, no livestock were harmed, no eerie sightings followed. The prints simply melted away with the thaw, leaving behind only whispers and a lingering question. Had something otherworldly passed through, or had the Victorians, straddling the line between faith and science, conjured a folklore to fill the gaps in their understanding? The devil's footprints endure not as evidence of the supernatural, but as a mirror to an era where every new discovery made the unknown feel both closer and more terrifying. Sometimes the most haunting mysteries aren't what we can't explain, but what we're forced to confront about our own hunger for answers. The morning mist clung to the valley like a burial shroud on that last ordinary day in 1852. By all accounts, the residents of Otterbothy, a tiny highland village nestled between the Grampian foothills, had gone about their routines as they always did. Crofters tended their sheep, children played near the burn, smoke curled lazily from cottage chimneys. Then, as abruptly as a snuffed candle, the entire community vanished. When a traveling merchant arrived the next week, he found empty homes with cold hearths, half-eaten meals still on tables, even a knitting needle dangling from wool as if dropped mid-stitch. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just 200 souls gone without a whisper. At first, authorities blamed geology. The village sat beneath Esgor nan Sinichian, a mountain notorious for loose scree. Perhaps a landslide had buried the settlement overnight, yet surveyors found no fresh rockfall, no disturbed earth. The local minister, Reverend Duncan MacAllister, insisted something more sinister was afoot. His journals describe finding Bibles left open to Revelation 16:16. The passage mentioning Armageddon in multiple cottages. Even stranger, every clock in Otterbothy had stopped between 2:15 and 2:20 in the morning, their hands frozen like accusatory fingers. Then came the whispers from nearby glens. A shepherd's boy claimed to have seen lights like will-o'-the-wisps dancing over the village that night. An elderly widow swore she heard pipes playing a tune no living man recognized, the notes carrying across the moors with unnatural clarity. The most chilling account came from a peddler who'd camped near Orturbothe's outskirts. He described waking to the sound of marching feet, hundreds of them, moving in perfect unison toward the mountain. When he peered from his tent, the road shimmered with figures in outdated plaids, their faces obscured by mist. By dawn, only silence remained. Modern researchers still grapple with the puzzle. Some cite mass hysteria, perhaps contamination of the village well with ergot fungus caused hallucinations and a panicked exodus. Others point to historical records suggesting Orturbothy lay along an old drover's route used by Jacobite rebels after Culloden. Could the villagers have sheltered fugitives only to be forcibly relocated by Crown soldiers? The truth may lie in the soil. Ground-penetrating radar surveys in 2012 revealed strange, funnel-shaped depressions beneath the old village green patterns consistent with sinkholes, yet arranged with eerie symmetry. Whatever claimed Orturbothy left behind more questions than answers. The case endures as a reminder that even in Victoria's reign of steam and industry, the land itself could swallow secrets whole. Today, hikers report an unnatural hush near the ruins, as if the wind itself avoids speaking the village name. The few stones still standing bear no inscriptions, only lichen-stained faces turned perpetually toward the mountain, as though waiting for whatever took them to bring them home. Doctors recoiled when they touched her, not from fear, but from the unmistakable jolt of electric current shooting through their fingers. In the winter of 1846, 14-year-old Angelique Cotton became an overnight sensation in La Perrière, France, not for any ordinary talent, but for a phenomenon that blurred the line between miracle and medical mystery. Described as électrique by the press, the girl seemed to carry an invisible storm in her frail frame. Furniture skittered away from her as if repelled by magnets. Needles embedded themselves in walls when she held them. Even more unsettling, witnesses swore sparks leapt from her fingertips when distressed, leaving behind the acrid scent of ozone. The scientific community, already enthralled by electricity's potential, descended on the village. Physicist François Arago, a luminary of the Paris Academy of Sciences, documented how Cotton's mere presence disrupted compass needles and made silk ribbons stand on end without contact. Yet the girl's condition defied simple explanation. During attacks, her pulse would triple, her skin flushing as if fevered, yet she remained lucid. Some physicians diagnosed hysteria, a catch-all term for unexplained female maladies, while others speculated she'd somehow become a human Leyden jar, storing static from the woolen mill where she worked. Superstition thrived in the gaps of understanding. Local priests accused her of demonic possession, pointing to her habit of involuntarily reciting Latin phrases she'd never learned. Spiritualists, meanwhile, hailed her as proof of animal magnetism, a popular theory bridging science and the occult. Even the act of writing took on eerie dimensions. Ink would sometimes boil off her quill before touching paper, leaving behind scorched parchment. The truth, like so many Victorian anomalies, may lie in overlooked medical realities. Modern neurologists speculate Cotton suffered from a rare form of epilepsy or hyperexplexia, conditions causing extreme startle reflexes and muscle spasms potent enough to generate measurable bioelectricity. Her case wasn't supernatural, just a quirk of physiology amplified by an era desperate to reconcile emerging science with lingering mysticism. Yet her legacy endures as a poignant footnote, a reminder that even in the age of reason, the human body could still conjure wonders no laboratory could yet explain. London didn't notice the fog at first. It crept in on December 9, 1873, the way winter mists always did, a grey veil over the Thames, a faint tang of coal smoke in the air. But by nightfall, the city was choking. This wasn't the romantic Dickensian pea soup locals joked about. This fog had teeth. It clung to clothing like wet ash, seeped under doors, stained handkerchiefs black when people coughed into them. By morning, the death toll began climbing, not from accidents in the impenetrable gloom, but from something far more insidious. The fog itself had turned lethal. Doctors rushed between homes to find patients gasping like fish on riverbanks, their lips tinged blue. Autopsies revealed lungs clogged with soot, airways scorched as if by acid. Birds dropped dead mid-flight, their tiny bodies piling up in market squares. The culprit, a perfect storm of industrial poisons trapped under a temperature inversion. Factories belching sulfur dioxide met coal fires burning in every hearth, their combined fumes thickened by stagnant air. The result was an airborne poison, a mix of sulfuric acid and particulate matter that seared delicate lung tissue. Victims didn't just suffocate, they dissolved from the inside. The city's response laid bare the era's dangerous priorities. Newspaper editors downplayed the crisis, blaming weak constitutions rather than unchecked pollution. Parliament tepidly debated clean air measures, only to table them when the fog lifted, citing economic concerns. After all, factories meant jobs and coal kept homes warm. But the 1873 fog left an invisible mark, not just on survivors' health but on London's collective memory. It proved modernity came with hidden costs that progress could literally kill. Yet the most haunting parallel lies in what followed, or rather, what didn't. The 1873 disaster foreshadowed the far deadlier Great Smog of 1952, which would claim 12,000 lives under nearly identical circumstances. The Victorians had their warning written in the soot-stained lips of the dead. That they chose to ignore it speaks volumes about an era torn between innovation and its consequences, a lesson we're still grappling with today as wildfire smoke and industrial emissions tint our own sky's unnatural hues. The killer fog wasn't just weather, it was a mirror reflecting the price we're willing to pay for the illusion of control over nature. Pascagoula, Mississippi should have been asleep. But in the sweltering summer of 1942, no one dared close their windows, not with the phantom barber on the prowl. Night after night, a shadowy figure slipped into homes, bypassing locked doors with unsettling ease. His target wasn't jewelry or cash, but something far more intimate: locks of hair. Women woke to find their braids shorn off mid-sleep, the pillow beside them scattered with snipped strands. A few even claimed to glimpse him, a tall man in dark clothing, moving silently as smoke, his face obscured by something resembling an old-fashioned surgical mask. The town spiraled into panic, forming armed patrols, while newspapers gleefully christened him the Phantom Barber, a name that evoked both Victorian penny dreadfuls and something far older, far darker. What made the case so unnerving wasn't just the bizarre crimes, but how they echoed a much older terror. 2 generations earlier, London had been gripped by the London Monster scare of 1790, a masked assailant who slashed women's dresses and hair in crowded streets. The hysteria became so intense that men seen carrying scissors were attacked by mobs. Now history seemed to be repeating itself in the American South, with mid-century anxieties layering over Victorian-era fears. Local authorities initially dismissed the Phantom Barber as mass hysteria until physical evidence mounted. One victim's bedroom window bore pry marks. Another found a smudged footprint on her vanity, the tread-matching work boots sold at the nearby shipyard. Theories about the barber's identity ranged from the plausible to the fantastical. Some blamed a German spy. Pascagoula was a hub for wartime shipbuilding, collecting hair for some occult radar jamming experiment. Others whispered of a deranged doctor, citing the surgical precision of the cuts. The most chilling account came from a night watchman who swore he'd confronted a figure crouched near the cemetery, only for the man to dart away with unnatural speed, leaving behind the scent of ether and a single pearl hairpin. Then, as abruptly as it began, the reign of the Phantom Barber ended. In August, police arrested a shipyard worker named William Dolan after neighbors reported him burning bundles of hair in his backyard. Though convicted only of burglary, prosecutors couldn't prove all the cuttings the attack ceased, yet questions lingered. Dolan had no medical training, nor any clear motive beyond a fixation confessed during interrogation. And why had some victims described their intruder as left-handed, while Dolan was right-handed? The case faded into obscurity, but its legacy endured as a textbook example of how old fears mutate to fit new eras. The Phantom Barber wasn't just a wartime oddity, he was the latest incarnation of a terror as old as the Victorians' obsession with nocturnal intruders, as timeless as the primal violation of having one's body altered while unconscious. In the end, the real horror lay not in the snipped locks, but in the realization that even in the modern age, darkness could still slip through the cracks of a locked window, leaving nothing behind but a few strands of hair and the unshakable feeling of being watched. The firelight cast shaky shadows across Amelia Cranswell's bedroom wall as she bolted upright, her scream lodged in her throat. The scratching at the window had started minutes before, a sound like dry twigs dragged across glass. But when the latch gave way with a snap, what crawled inside Croglin Grange that summer night in 1875 was no ordinary intruder. Witnesses would later describe a gaunt figure with eyes like smoldering coals, its elongated fingers clawing at the bedclothes as it scuttled toward Amelia with inhuman speed. By the time her brothers burst in, wielding candlesticks like clubs, the thing had already sunk its teeth into her neck, not with the clean punctures of folklore, but with a savage, ragged tear, as if its jaws were unhinging wider than any human should. What unfolded next read like a page torn from Bram Stoker's notes, though it predated Dracula by 2 decades. The Cranswell family's ordeal didn't end with that first attack. Night after night, the creature returned, its presence heralded by an inexplicable chill that seeped through the stone walls of their Cumberland estate. Servants quit in terror after glimpsing a hunched silhouette perched in the yew tree outside Amelia's window. A local doctor, summoned to treat her worsening anemia, noted with horror that her wounds refused to clot, oozing blackish fluid despite all remedies. When a watchman fired his musket at the figure one midnight, it let out a screech like a bat mixed with a steam whistle before vanishing into the fog unharmed. Desperation drove the Cranswells to exhume a nearby grave rumored to hold an 18th-century smuggler who dabbled in the occult. What they found defied all reason. The corpse, interred decades earlier, showed no signs of decay, its lips still flecked with fresh blood. The villagers acted swiftly, driving an ash stake through its heart in a scene ripped straight from folklore. The resulting scream, witnesses swore, came not from the body's rotting lungs but from the earth itself, a sound so piercing it scattered sheep for miles. Yet the story's true eeriness lies in its stubborn refusal to fit neatly into legend. Unlike fictional vampires, the Croglin creature displayed no fear of crucifixes or garlic. It moved with a jerky, insectile gait, and its preferred entry point, a high window no ladder could reach, hinted at unnatural agility. Modern skeptics suggest the attacker might have been a feral human suffering from porphyria, a blood disorder causing photosensitivity and gum recession that mimics fangs. Others point to a twisted inheritance dispute. Property records show the Cranswells gained land from a reclusive cousin who died mysteriously around the same time. But perhaps the most unsettling footnote emerged a century later, when researchers discovered the original account had been quietly embellished by a Gothic novelist who dined with the Cranswells' descendants. The truth, as always, slips through our fingers like grave dust. What remains is the primal terror of that bedroom, seen the certainty that something, whether man or nightmare, once pressed its face against the glass, hungry and patient, waiting for the latch to give. The Croglin Grange Vampire endures not because it fits the myth, but because it proves how easily the dark blurs the line between superstition and something far more visceral, the fear that death might not always stay buried. From phantom airships hovering over London to streets drowned in beer, from lead-masked corpses on Brazilian shores to cabinet makers vanishing mid-stroke, the Victorian era wasn't just a time of corsets and teacups. It was a pressure cooker of human imagination, where the march of progress collided with primal fears in ways that still send shivers down our spines. These 30 bizarre events aren't just curiosities. They're cracked mirrors reflecting the anxieties of an age hurtling toward modernity at breakneck speed. Consider how often these mysteries orbit industrialization's dark side. The Great Stink of 1858 forced London to confront the literal rot beneath its glittering facade, a city so consumed with empire it had forgotten to clean its own streets. The Hyde Park rail disaster laid bare the human cost of efficiency, where profit trumped safety until bodies piled high enough to demand change. Even Spring-Heeled Jack, with his mechanical leaps and metallic claws, feels like folklore's revenge on the machine age, a gremlin in the gears of progress. These weren't just strange happenings, they were warnings written in blood, smoke, and superstition. Then there's science, both hero and villain in these tales. Louis Le Prince's disappearance smells of cutthroat competition in the birth of cinema, while the Electric Girl of La Perrière became a living lightning rod for debates about medicine and mysticism. The Devil's Footprints in Devon, a perfect storm of rural folklore and the terrifying realization that even snowdrifts could become pages in a mystery science couldn't yet decode. Victorians worshipped at the altar of discovery, but every laboratory breakthrough seemed to unlock new terrors, from cursed paintings that survived fires to dancing plagues that mocked the era's obsession with self-control. But perhaps no theme looms larger than death, the era's glittering obsession. Resurrection Mary haunting Chicago's Archer Avenue in her burial lace, Mercy Brown's vampiric heart burned to ash, the mistletoe boughs bride suffocating as revelry roared on. These aren't ghost stories. They're desperate conversations about mortality in an age when cholera could erase a family by breakfast and graveyards overflowed faster than cities could expand. The Victorians dressed their dead in finery, photographed them as if sleeping, and sewed hair jewelry not because they loved death but because they needed to tame it. So what do you think? Did Spring-Heeled Jack really bound over London's rooftops, or was he some aristocrat's steam-powered prank gone wrong? Could the Croglin Grange Vampire have been a feral heir locked away for shame? The comments are open, and I'd love to hear which mystery hooked you hardest, because the real magic of these stories isn't just their strangeness, it's how they force us to ask in our own age of AI and quantum physics. What unsolved oddities will future generations dig up from our time, shaking their heads at what we couldn't or wouldn't explain? The past never really dies, it just waits for us to notice the shadows it left behind.